The morning sun streamed through Zara Johnson's bedroom window as she stood in front of her mirror, a bright smile lighting up her face. After 6 years of chemical straighteners and painful styling sessions, the 16-year-old had finally embraced her natural hair. Her dark, beautiful curls formed a perfect crown around her face, each coil springing with life and energy. "Mom, I'm ready," Zara called out, grabbing her backpack from her bed. She had spent extra time getting ready this morning, wanting everything to be perfect for her first day showing her natural hair at Riverside High School. In the kitchen, her mother Diane looked up from her coffee and gasped with joy. "Baby, you look absolutely beautiful." She walked over and gently touched one of Zara's curls. "Your grandmother would be so proud to see you like this." Zara's 13-year-old sister, Tanya, came running down the stairs. "Sis, you look amazing. Can you do my hair like that when it grows out more?" Their father, James, lowered his newspaper and smiled warmly at his daughter. "There's my girl, showing the world her true self." The drive to school was filled with excited chatter as Zara talked about her plans for the day. She had AP History first period, followed by her favorite class, chemistry. Her best friend Maya had been texting her all morning, eager to see her new look. As Zara walked through the school's main entrance, she felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some students smiled and waved, while others whispered to their friends. Maya ran up to her, squealing with excitement. "Girl, you did it. You look gorgeous." The two friends hugged, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. First period started normally. Mr. Thompson was discussing the Civil War when the classroom phone rang. He answered it, then turned to Zara. "The principal would like to see you in her office." Zara's heart started beating faster. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? As she walked down the quiet hallway, her shoes echoing against the lockers, she tried to stay calm. Maybe Principal Matthews wanted to talk about the upcoming student council elections. The main office was quiet except for the gentle hum of computers and the occasional ring of phones. Mrs. Garcia, the secretary, gave Zara a strange look as she pointed toward the principal's office. "Go right in, dear. She's waiting for you." Principal Matthews sat behind her large desk, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she reviewed some papers. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked up as Zara entered, her expression unreadable. "Please sit down, Ms. Johnson," Principal Matthews said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Zara sat, suddenly very aware of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Ms. Johnson, it has come to my attention that your current hairstyle violates our school's dress code policy." Principal Matthews pulled out a copy of the student handbook. Section 4.3 clearly states that all hairstyles must be neat, conservative, and non-distracting. Zara's mouth went dry. "But Principal Matthews, this is my natural hair. I'm not wearing any style, this is just how it grows from my head." Nevertheless, Principal Matthews continued, "Several teachers have reported that your hair is causing a distraction in their classrooms. We pride ourselves on maintaining a professional learning environment at Riverside High." Tears started forming in Zara's eyes, but she blinked them back. With trembling hands, she reached up to touch her curls. "This is part of my culture, my identity. There's nothing unprofessional about natural black hair." Principal Matthews' expression hardened. "This is not about culture, Ms. Johnson. This is about following school rules. I'm issuing you a 3-day suspension, effective immediately. You may return when your hair meets our dress code standards." Zara sat there, stunned. The room seemed to spin around her as Principal Matthews wrote out the suspension slip. She couldn't believe this was happening, not in 2025, not after all the progress that had been made in fighting hair discrimination. As she walked out of the office clutching the pink suspension slip, Zara pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She had to call her parents. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every black student who had ever been made to feel ashamed of their natural hair. Maya was waiting outside the office, concern written all over her face. "What happened?" she asked, but Zara could barely speak through her tears. The hallway had started to fill with students changing classes, and their curious stares felt like tiny daggers against her skin. This wasn't the end, Zara decided as she walked toward the school exit. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, This unfair suspension would be the spark that started it all. Diane Johnson was in the middle of preparing for a court case when her phone buzzed. Seeing Zara's name on the screen, she felt a flutter of concern. Her daughter never called during school hours. When she heard Zara's trembling voice explaining what had happened, the mother's hands gripped her desk so tight her knuckles turned white. "Stay right where you are, baby. Dad and I are coming to get you." Diane's voice was steady, but inside, she was shaking with anger. As a civil rights attorney, she had handled dozens of discrimination cases, but she never thought her own daughter would become a victim of such blatant prejudice. James Johnson was already heading to his car when Diane called him. 20 years of marriage meant they could read each other's thoughts, even through the phone. "They suspended our baby girl over her natural hair," Diane said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm meeting you at the school." The couple arrived at Riverside High within 15 minutes of each other. They found Zara sitting on a bench outside the main entrance, her shoulders slumped, still clutching the pink suspension slip. Maya sat beside her, one arm wrapped protectively around her friend's shoulders. "Let me see that paper," James said quietly, taking the suspension notice from Zara's hands. As he read it, his jaw clenched tight. 23 years as a civil rights lawyer had taught him to control his anger, but this was different. This was his daughter. Diane pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the suspension slip, of Zara's natural hair, of her tear-stained face. She had learned long ago that documentation was crucial in cases like this. "Maya, sweetheart," she said gently, "would you be willing to write down what you saw today? We might need witness statements." Back at home, 13-year-old Tanya was already in action mode. She had rushed home from middle school after getting texts from Zara about what happened. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by black hair care products and history books borrowed from their grandmother's collection, she started crafting social media posts. Day 1, my sister got suspended for wearing her natural hair. RT to show support. Hashtag justice for Zara. Hashtag natural hair is not a crime. Tanya typed, adding a beautiful photo of Zara from that morning. Within hours, the post had already gained hundreds of retweets and supportive comments. In the living room, Diane and James sat with Zara, planning their next steps. "First thing tomorrow morning, I'm filing a formal complaint with the school board," Diane said, her laptop open to a document full of notes. "This is a clear violation of the Crown Act, and Principal Matthews knows it." James nodded, looking through similar cases on his tablet. "We need to contact the local NAACP Chapter 2. This isn't just about you, Zara. This is about every black student who might face the same discrimination." Zara sat between her parents, feeling stronger with each passing moment. The initial shock and hurt were giving way to determination. "Can I help?" she asked. "I want to do something more than just wait for 3 days." "Actually," Diane said, a small smile forming on her face, "I think it's time we call your Aunt Regina at the local news station. People need to know what's happening at Riverside High." Just then, Tanya burst into the living room, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, Dad, you need to see this. My post about Zara has gone viral. People are sharing their own stories of hair discrimination, and there's a hashtag trending. Hashtag Riverside High doing wrong." The family gathered around Tanya's phone, scrolling through hundreds of supportive messages. Former students from Riverside High were sharing similar experiences. Parents were expressing outrage. Civil rights organizations were reaching out, offering support. As the evening wore on, their house became a command center of sorts. Aunt Regina arrived with her news crew, setting up in the living room for an interview. The president of the local NAACP called, promising full support. Other parents from Riverside High started calling, sharing stories of their own children facing similar discrimination. Zara watched it all unfold from her favorite spot on the couch, her natural curls catching the light from the setting sun. The pain of the morning's humiliation was still there, but it was now mixed with something else: hope. She looked at her mother organizing documents, her father making calls, her sister managing social media, and felt a surge of pride. This suspension wasn't going to be the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than herself. By 7 o'clock the next morning, a crowd had already gathered outside Riverside High School. Students, parents, and community members held signs reading "My hair, my culture, and natural hair is professional." The local news van from Channel 5, where Aunt Regina worked, was parked nearby, its camera crew capturing the growing protest. Maya stood at the front of the student group, wearing her hair in its natural state for the first time in 3 years. Next to her, 20 other black students had also come to school with their natural hair, standing in solidarity. They formed a powerful sight against the morning sun, their different curl patterns and styles showing the beautiful diversity of black hair. My daughter spent years feeling ashamed of her natural hair, one mother told the news cameras, wiping tears from her eyes. She would cry every Sunday night while I straightened it for school. No more. Not after today. Inside the school board's office across town, phones rang nonstop. Email inboxes were flooded with messages from concerned citizens and civil rights organizations. The hashtag Riverside Highdoing Wrong had reached national trending status overnight, thanks to Tanya's social media campaign and several viral videos of former students sharing their experiences. Sarah Martinez, a senior at Riverside High, stood before the growing crowd with a microphone in her hand. 2 years ago, I was told my box braids were too urban for the school dance, she shared, her voice strong despite her tears. I took them out and straightened my hair. I've regretted staying silent ever since. But today, we speak up for Zara. We speak up for all of us. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Local business owners from the community showed up with water bottles and snacks for the protesters. Ms. Jackson, who owned the beauty supply store down the street, handed out free hair products to the students. Be proud of your crown, she told each one. Around 10 o'clock, Dr. Thompson, the superintendent of schools, arrived for an emergency meeting. He hadn't expected to see hundreds of peaceful protesters, 3 news vans, and a line of students all wearing their natural hair. His assistant hurriedly whispered in his ear, updating him about the situation's viral status on social media. Meanwhile, at the Johnson house, Zara sat with her parents watching the live coverage on TV. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. A famous black actress had shared Tanya's post, bringing even more attention to the cause. Civil rights lawyers from across the country were reaching out to her parents, offering their support. Look at this, Diane said, showing her phone to James. 5 other schools in the state have students protesting their dress codes now. This is becoming a movement. Back at the school, Maya led the student protesters in a powerful moment of silence. For exactly 3 minutes, one for each day of Zara's suspension, they stood completely still, their natural hair gleaming in the sunlight. The image would later become the symbol of their movement, shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Teachers began joining the protest during their free periods. Mrs. Carter, Zara's English teacher, spoke to the news crew with tears in her eyes. I've been teaching here for 15 years, she said. I never spoke up when I saw students struggling with these unfair rules. That silence ends today. By afternoon, other schools in the district had organized their own demonstrations. Students across the city wore their natural hair in solidarity. The local barbershops and hair salons closed for the day, placing "Standing with Zara" signs in their windows. The protests remained peaceful but grew more powerful by the hour. Community leaders took turns speaking, sharing their own experiences with hair discrimination. A group of elementary school girls sat on their parents' shoulders, their natural puffs decorated with ribbons, holding signs that read, "My hair is beautiful." As the sun began to set, the crowd had swelled to over 1,000 people. The story had been picked up by national news networks. Riverside High's discriminatory action had unknowingly sparked a conversation that was now spreading across the country. Inside her office, Principal Matthews watched the scenes unfolding outside her window. The sight of so many students, parents, and community members standing together made something shift inside her. She picked up her phone and began making calls. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for things to change. Principal Sarah Matthews sat alone in her living room that evening, the TV muted but still showing coverage of the day's protests. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from the school board, other principals, and concerned parents. But for the first time in her 30-year career in education, she wasn't thinking about policies or procedures. She was thinking about people. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, browser tabs filled with articles about the Crown Act and the history of black hair discrimination. Another tab showed old yearbook photos from Riverside High, where she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. The gradual disappearance of natural black hairstyles over the years as dress codes became stricter. How did I not see it? She whispered to herself, remembering all the times students had come to her office, trying to explain the cultural significance of their hair. She had always hidden behind the rulebook, never questioning why those rules existed in the first place. Her daughter Rachel called around midnight, her voice tight with concern. "Mom, are you okay? I saw the news." There was a pause before Rachel continued. "You know, my best friend in college used to straighten her hair every day because she was afraid of looking unprofessional at her internship. She got chemical burns once from the relaxer." That story hit Principal Matthews hard. She got up from her couch and walked to her home office, pulling out her old teaching journals from when she first started as a young educator. Back then, she had written about wanting to make a difference in students' lives, about creating a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. Somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of that dream. The rules and regulations had become more important than the students themselves. She picked up her remote and unmuted the TV, really listening this time to the stories being shared at the protest. A former student was speaking, tears in her eyes, about how she had quit the cheerleading team after being told her box braids weren't appropriate for competitions. Another student talked about missing picture day because she was sent home over her twists. Each story felt like a personal failure to Principal Matthews. She spent the next few hours diving deep into research. She learned about protective styles, about the damage caused by chemical straighteners, about the deep cultural and historical significance of black hair. She read personal essays written by black women and girls about their hair journeys. She watched documentaries about the natural hair movement. Around 3 in the morning, she found herself looking at photos of Zara Johnson from the school's recent art show. Zara had won first place for her photography series on Black Joy. In the photos from that day, her hair had been straightened to comply with the dress code. Principal Matthews remembered complimenting her on looking nice and neat. "I was part of the problem," she said aloud to her empty house. Her voice shook as the realization hit her fully. For years, she had enforced rules that hurt students, rules that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with forcing students to conform to a narrow definition of professional appearance. As the sun began to rise, Principal Matthews hadn't slept at all. Instead, she had filled a notebook with ideas for change. Real, meaningful change. Not just removing the discriminatory hair policies, but actively creating an environment that celebrated diversity. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. She picked up her phone and started drafting an email to the school board. Then she deleted it. No, this needed more than just an email. This needed her to take a public stand. She began writing a speech instead, her hands trembling slightly as she typed. "To the students, parents, and community members of Riverside High," she began. "I write this with a heavy heart and open eyes. Yesterday, I made a decision that hurt a student and upheld a system of discrimination that has no place in our school. Today, I want to do more than apologize. I want to make things right." Looking at her reflection in the window, Principal Matthews touched her own perfectly styled gray hair. For decades, she had believed that there was only one way to look professional, only one way to be taken seriously. How many students had she hurt by forcing that belief on them? The sun was fully up now, marking the beginning of a new day. Principal Matthews straightened her shoulders and picked up her phone. It was time to make some calls. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Principal Matthews walked through the front doors of Riverside High School. She looked different today, her usual crisp suit replaced by a more casual blazer, and her tight bun let down into a simple ponytail. The protest crowd outside fell silent as she passed, surprised by her early arrival. Instead of heading to her office, she walked straight to the school's main entrance, where news cameras and protesters had gathered. Without any announcement or preparation, she stepped up to the microphones that had been set up for the morning's planned protest speeches. "Good morning," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "My name is Sarah Matthews, and I am the principal who suspended Zara Johnson for wearing her natural hair." The crowd stirred, but she continued speaking. "I'm not here to defend that decision. I'm here to admit I was wrong." Phones came up throughout the crowd, recording this unexpected moment. Maya, who had been organizing that morning's protest, stepped closer, her natural curls bouncing in the morning light. "Last night, I spent hours educating myself about the cultural significance of black hair. about the damage caused by chemical straighteners, and about the deep pain that discriminatory policies have inflicted on our students. Principal Matthews paused, taking a deep breath. I am ashamed that it took this long for me to understand. She pulled out a piece of paper from her blazer pocket. I have here a draft of a new dress code policy that celebrates all hair textures and styles. But I don't want to just announce changes. I want to create them together with our community. The crowd murmured in surprise as Principal Matthews continued. I'm calling an emergency meeting with the school board this afternoon. But before that, I want to invite Zara Johnson and her family to my office. Not as a principal enforcing rules, but as a person who needs to listen and learn. At the Johnson house, Zara and her family watched the live broadcast on TV, stunned into silence. Diane and James exchanged looks of surprise while Tanya rapidly typed updates on social media. Minutes later, their phone rang. It was Principal Matthews' office requesting a meeting at 9 a.m. When the Johnsons arrived at school, they found Principal Matthews had transformed the conference room. The usual long table was gone, replaced by comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. On the side table, there were photos from the school's archives showing how dress codes had changed over the decades. Before we begin, Principal Matthews said as the family settled in, I want you to see something. She turned on a projector, showing a presentation she had prepared overnight. It included statistics about hair discrimination, testimonies from former students, and research about the psychological impact of discriminatory policies on Black students. Zara, she said, turning to face the teenager directly, your suspension is not just cancelled, it's being completely removed from your record. But that's just the start. I want you and your family to help us create real change at Riverside High. Tears formed in Principal Matthews' eyes as she continued. We need a complete overhaul of our policies, our training, and our understanding. And who better to guide us than the family who had the courage to stand up and say enough? Zara sat up straighter in her chair, her natural curls framing her face proudly. For the first time since this all began, she saw Principal Matthews not as an authority figure to fear, but as someone capable of growth and change. The meeting lasted for hours. They discussed creating a student-led diversity council, organizing cultural awareness workshops, and establishing new guidelines that would protect and celebrate all forms of cultural expression. As they wrapped up, Principal Matthews made one final announcement. The school board meeting is at 2 p.m. today. I'd like all of you to be there, not as observers, but as equal partners in creating change. And Zara, she added with a gentle smile, would you be willing to share your story? The board needs to hear firsthand about the impact of these discriminatory policies. Outside the conference room, the hallways were filled with students and teachers, all waiting to hear the outcome. When Zara emerged with a smile on her face, a cheer erupted through the crowd. The story of her suspension was about to become something much more powerful, a story of transformation, education, and hope. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as students, teachers, and community members filed in for the first Cultural Education Day at Riverside High. It had been 2 weeks since Principal Matthews' public apology, and the school was already transforming in ways no one had expected. Colorful banners hung from the walls, celebrating different cultural hairstyles and their histories. Local Black hair care specialists had set up booths around the room, ready to share their knowledge. Ms. Jackson from the beauty supply store had brought an impressive display showing the evolution of Black hair care products through the decades. Zara stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Her natural curls were styled in a beautiful twist-out, and she wore a t-shirt that read My Crown, My Culture, designed by the school's new Student Diversity Council. Next to her, Principal Matthews helped direct visitors to different sections of the event. Can you believe this all started with your suspension? Maya whispered to Zara as they watched more people stream in. The local news crews were back, but this time they were capturing something positive. Aunt Regina's camera crew focused on a group of elementary school girls learning about protective styling at one of the educational stations. Dr. Lisa Thompson, a respected Black historian from the local university, took the stage for the first presentation of the day. The history of Black hair is the history of resistance, beauty, and cultural pride, she began. The audience, including Principal Matthews in the front row, took notes eagerly. In another corner of the auditorium, James and Diane Johnson led a workshop about the legal history of hair discrimination and the importance of the Crown Act. Teachers who had once sent students to the principal's office over their hairstyles now sat and listened, many of them wiping away tears as they understood the impact of their past actions. "Your hair is not just hair," Diane explained to the group. "It's a connection to your ancestry, your culture, your identity." Principal Matthews nodded from her seat, remembering her own journey of understanding from just weeks ago. During the lunch break, local Black-owned restaurants provided food, while students from the Performing Arts Department presented a powerful dance piece about hair discrimination. Tanya, who had choreographed part of the performance, beamed with pride as she watched from backstage. The afternoon sessions included practical workshops. Professional Black hairstylists taught proper hair care techniques, while counselors led discussions about building self-esteem and cultural pride. Even some of the school board members who had initially resisted change were there, actively participating in the conversations. "This is more than just changing rules," Principal Matthews said during her afternoon speech. "This is about creating a school where every student feels seen, valued, and celebrated." She gestured to the newly formed Student Diversity Council, sitting together in their matching T-shirts. And none of this would have happened without one brave student who stood up for her rights. The day's most powerful moment came when students began sharing their stories. One by one, they stepped up to the microphone. Students with braids, locks, afros, and twists. Each one spoke about their experiences, their struggles, and their hope for the future. Some had previously kept their natural hair hidden, afraid of judgment or punishment. Now they stood proud, their various hairstyles on display. Ms. Carter, Zara's English teacher, announced a new curriculum edition that would include literature about Black hair culture and identity. The library had already ordered dozens of new books on the subject, and a reading corner was set up at the event showcasing these titles. As the day wound down, Principal Matthews gathered everyone for a final announcement. "This is just the beginning," she said, standing beside Zara and her family. "Starting next month, we'll be hosting monthly cultural education sessions. We're also creating a mentorship program pairing younger students with older ones who can guide them in embracing their natural hair and cultural identity." The crowd erupted in applause. Parents hugged their children, teachers hugged their students, and friends hugged each other. What had started as a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement of education and acceptance. Zara looked around the auditorium, taking in all the smiling faces and natural hairstyles on display. Her own story had helped create this change, but it was the community coming together that made it powerful. As she watched Principal Matthews high-five a group of students wearing their hair naturally for the first time, she knew that Riverside High would never be the same again. The school board meeting room had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, all waiting for the most important vote in Riverside High's history. On the agenda was the new, inclusive dress code policy that Principal Matthews and the Student Diversity Council had spent weeks crafting. Zara sat in the front row between her parents, dressed in a professional blue blazer that complemented her beautiful natural curls. The Diversity Council members sat nearby, each wearing their My Crown, My Culture T-shirts under their formal jackets. Principal Matthews stood at the podium, ready to present the final draft of the new policy. "Members of the board," she began, her voice clear and confident. "1 month ago, I enforced a discriminatory policy that hurt our students. Today, we have the chance to replace that policy with one that celebrates diversity and protects cultural expression." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing photos from the Cultural Education Day. "These pictures show what our school can be when we embrace inclusion rather than enforce conformity." The screen filled with images of students proudly wearing their natural hair, braids, twists, and locks. The new policy was comprehensive. It explicitly protected all natural hair textures and cultural hairstyles. It removed all language about hair being distracting or unprofessional. Instead, it emphasized the importance of cultural expression and personal identity. But this isn't just about changing words on paper, Principal Matthews continued. She introduced Ms. Carter, who had been appointed as the new Director of Cultural Education. Together, they outlined the mandatory sensitivity training program that all staff members would need to complete. Dr. Thompson, the historian who had spoken at Cultural Education Day, stepped up next. She had helped design the training curriculum, ensuring it covered the historical context of hair discrimination and its lasting impacts on the Black community. The board members listened intently as Principal Matthews explained the next phase of changes. Every teacher would receive resources about cultural hair care and styling. The school would install new mirrors in the locker rooms that were better suited for students with different hair textures. Even the art supplies would be updated to include a wider range of colors for depicting different skin tones and hair types. And most importantly, Principal Matthews said, gesturing to the Diversity Council, "Our students will have a permanent voice in school policies." She announced the creation of a student-led advisory committee that would meet monthly with school administration to discuss cultural sensitivity issues. When the time came for public comments, dozens of people stepped forward to speak. Parents shared stories of their children finally feeling comfortable at school. Teachers admitted their past mistakes and committed to doing better. Students spoke about their hopes for the future. Maya approached the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Last month, my best friend was suspended for wearing her natural hair. Today, I'm wearing my natural hair too, and I'm not afraid anymore." She looked at Zara and smiled. "This new policy isn't just about rules, it's about letting us be ourselves." The board members began their discussion. Some had questions about implementation, which Principal Matthews answered with detailed plans. Others shared their own learning experiences from the past month. The room held its breath as the board president called for the vote. "All in favor of adopting the new inclusive dress code policy and cultural education program, please raise your hand." One by one, hands went up. When the final count was made, the vote was unanimous. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Tears flowed freely as people hugged each other, celebrating this historic moment. Principal Matthews turned to Zara and her family, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "You helped us create real change." After the meeting, as people filed out of the room, Principal Matthews made one final announcement. The school would host a celebration the following week, not just for the new policy, but for all the students who had been affected by the old one. It would be a day of natural hair pride, cultural appreciation, and community healing. Zara stood with her family, watching as teachers and students congratulated each other. Her father put an arm around her shoulders. "You did it, baby girl," he whispered. "You really did it." But Zara knew it wasn't just her, it was everyone who had stood up, spoken out, and worked together for change. As she looked around the room at all the smiling faces and natural hairstyles, she felt proud to have been part of this transformation. Riverside High wasn't just changing its rules, it was changing its heart. 1 year had passed since Zara Johnson's suspension, and Riverside High School looked very different. The hallways were filled with students confidently wearing their natural hair in all its beautiful forms. Afros, braids, twists, locks, and everything in between. But the changes went far deeper than just appearances. On this particular morning, Zara, now a senior, stood on stage in the school auditorium. As president of the Diversity Council, she was welcoming visitors from 20 different schools across the state. They had all come to learn about what the media was calling the Riverside Revolution. "A year ago, I was suspended for wearing my natural hair," Zara began, her voice strong and clear. "Today, I'm speaking to you as part of a school that celebrates every student's cultural identity." The audience, filled with educators, administrators, and student leaders, listened intently. Principal Matthews sat in the front row, smiling proudly. She had become a different kind of leader over the past year. Instead of enforcing rules from behind her desk, she could often be found sitting with students during lunch, learning about their cultures and experiences. Today, she was scheduled to give a presentation titled "From Discrimination to Celebration, A Principal's Journey." The school's transformation had caught national attention. Documentary filmmakers had visited last month to capture the story. They interviewed students who spoke about feeling truly seen and accepted for the first time in their academic lives. They filmed the monthly cultural education sessions, which now included celebrations of various cultural traditions beyond just hair. Maya, who had stood by Zara from the beginning, now led the school's mentorship program. She worked with younger students who were just beginning to embrace their natural hair, offering support and guidance. Sometimes, she told the visitors, All it takes is one person saying your hair is beautiful to change someone's entire self-image. Miss Carter's English classes have become a model for cultural integration in education. Students read literature about identity and self-acceptance, wrote poetry about their experiences, and created powerful pieces of art celebrating their heritage. The walls of her classroom were covered with student work that told stories of cultural pride and personal growth. Tanya, now a freshman at Riverside High, had turned her social media campaign into a full-fledged student magazine. Natural Beauty Monthly featured stories, photos, and articles about cultural hairstyles and identity. The magazine had subscribers from schools across the country. During the lunch break, visitors toured the school's new Cultural Heritage Center. What used to be an unused storage room had been transformed into a beautiful space filled with books, photographs, and artifacts celebrating diverse cultures. A special section was dedicated to the history of black hair, including the original suspension slip that had started it all. Principal Matthews took the stage in the afternoon. Change isn't always comfortable, she admitted to the crowd, but discomfort can lead to growth. She shared how the school's test scores had improved since implementing the new inclusive policies. When students feel valued and accepted, they perform better academically. It's that simple. The day's most powerful moment came when a group of elementary school students performed a play they had written about hair discrimination. Their small voices carried a big message about acceptance and pride. In the audience, several of the visiting administrators wiped away tears. As the event came to a close, Zara's parents watched from the back of the auditorium. Diane squeezed James's hand as they listened to their daughter speak about the future. "We're not done yet," Zara told the crowd. "This is just the beginning of creating truly inclusive schools everywhere." After the visitors left, Principal Matthews gathered with Zara and the Diversity Council for their regular meeting. On the agenda was their newest initiative, helping other schools create their own cultural education programs. Already, 5 other high schools had adopted versions of Riverside's inclusive policies. Sometimes, Principal Matthews said, looking around at the students she had once tried to control with strict rules, "The best things in life come from our biggest mistakes." She touched her own hair, which she now wore in a more relaxed style. "You all taught me that leadership isn't about enforcing rules, it's about creating spaces where everyone can thrive." As the sun set on another day at Riverside High, Zara walked through the halls one last time. Senior year was almost over, but her legacy would live on. In every confident smile, in every proudly worn natural hairstyle, in every cultural celebration, she saw the proof that one person's stand for justice could create lasting change.